Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia. I am the Director of Community Engagement for the VIVO Music Festival. And here today we have Samuel Adler, a wonderful composer who came to our season 4 event and composed for us as well. Welcome.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. So how are you doing during this time, during this pandemic?
So far, so good. Let's put it that way. And you know, it's very dangerous for a composer to be home most of the time because all he does is write music and, you know, too much of it.
Yes.
I sent you the duo, by the way.
Yes. Oh, yes, I received it. I will take a look at it.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're doing the Meadowmountetudes, and maybe I should say a few words about them.
Yes, that would be really great.
Well, many years ago, I think about 20 years ago, they asked me to come to Meadowmount, which is the very famous camp started by Galamian, who was, of course, also a very famous pedagogue, violin pedagogue. Many of the great violinists had studied with him, but he disliked contemporary music. And he didn't feel that violinists and any string player should play anything beyond, well, Brahms, maybe Debussy sonata, but not much else. And so he never asked contemporary composers to come there and even to allow any contemporary or 20th century music to be played by the students. Well, the new people who took over, the two teachers that I dedicated the last two of the Meadowmountetudes to them, they asked me to come up, and they asked me to give a lecture the first or second day I was there to all the violinists to tell them about the violin repertoire of the 20th century. And, you know, I talked to them about Bartok and about the Stravinsky Concerto and Hindemith and many of the wonderful pieces written by American composers written for violin. Well, they were very enthusiastic. And I told them that in years past, especially during the Bach period and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, people asked composers to write pieces so that could play them the next day or something like that. Or Bach wrote pieces that he actually performed the next day. So did Mozart and Haydn. Well, a little girl came up to me and said, Mr. Adler, I want you to write a piece for me for tomorrow. I said, well, it's a challenge. So I did. I wrote the first of the Meadowmountetudes. Are we?
I think your video went bye-bye. There we go.
The first of the Meadowmountetudes for this little girl. And she said, I will play it tomorrow. Well, I don't know if she played it tomorrow, but the next day I talked to all the violists. And I talked to them about, especially about the many sonatas by Hindemith, but there are many viola sonatas by other composers, including myself. So after that, I thought, that's fine. And I was ready to leave. Another little girl came up to me and said, Mr. Adler, you're not a very nice man. I said, what did I do to you? Well, she said, I'm a much better violinist than my sister, and you wrote a piece for her yesterday, and now I want you to write a piece for me. Otherwise, you're not a very nice man if you don't do that. Well, I can't resist that. So I wrote the second one for her, and those two sisters all became violinists and all have played them. And then the other two were written for two of the violin teachers that were at Meadowmount that year. And you know, etudes are supposed to explore techniques that come with the times. I mean, Paganini wrote etudes that, you know, are more difficult than anything else ever written. And yet, if you can play them, you can play all the music of the 19th century and even the 20th century. But some 20th century composers have recognize that we are writing music that is not necessarily something that students learn in their basic violin or viola or cello or bass techniques.
Yes.
So I wrote each of them with a different problem. You know, the first one has its problems. The second one has a problem of listening. The third one with the big skips and harmonics.
Yeah.
And the fourth one just bang up, you know, go for broke kind of
Yeah.
piece. So that's the story behind the Meadowmountetudes.
That's amazing.
And, you know, I've written etudes for piano. I'm not a pianist. I'm a violinist myself and play the viola. But you know, every instrument really needs etudes. And for instance, I've written a series of cantos for solo instruments, now 24 of them, for 24 different instruments. The first one was for trumpet, the second one for trombone, third one for violin, and so on. And they all explore problems that come up in contemporary music. And these are not etudes just to practice at home, but actually concert etudes in the tradition of Liszt or Schumann, or, you know, the great pianists of the last century who wrote, like Paganini, concert versions of etudes. And that's behind the many etudes that I've written for various instruments.
Well, that's really great. I mean, I remember when I was getting to know all four movements of the Meadowmountetudes, it's very interesting what, like you said, what each movement targets. Like, for example, the first movement, it's entitled Irregular Meters, where you really have to make sure you have a constant, steady eighth note, which I actually use as an example to teach my students about steadiness.
That's what it's supposed to do. That's
yes.
right.
Yes.
Because there are many composers like Stravinsky and many American composers who write variable meters, and which students usually don't study until they get to something like the Meadowmountetudes.
Yes, yes. With my students, for example, I'm always asking them, okay, what's the time signature here and there, or other questions to have them think about what else is on the page aside from the notes, like what's the key signature, what do you think this could represent. It gives the person just a little bit more to think about, as opposed to just like written instructions on a page.
Learn the note.
Yes. Yes. The second movement, which is entitled Atonal Waltz, it's actually one of my favorites. For me, it reminds me a little bit of Prokofiev's Cinderella, the waltz in it, just because I feel like what you said in terms of when you were at Meadowmount, there was a resistance as to wanting to learn 20th century compositions. And with Prokofiev, Stravinsky, Bartok, they really started to kind of go over the line of what was the norm back in the 19th, 18th centuries, and
especially Bartok in the quartets.
Yes,
those are really experimental. Prokofiev and Shostakovich less so.
Yes,
but Bartok really, and Hindemith and Stravinsky and Copland and Piston, they took it much further.
Yes,
and you have to be very careful. At Schoenberg, for instance, you have to be careful. You know, after you hear, for instance, the third string quartet of Schoenberg, which is a fantastic piece, but it is 12-tone, and it's not, I mean, if you just think of everything as tonal and everything having to have a key, you're going to be lost. But if you just listen to it once, it becomes natural.
Yeah,
so that's why the second movement.
I actually have a funny story about learning the Bartok's third string quartet. So at the time, I was in a Cleveland Institute of Music, and they had a wonderful chamber music program called the Intensive String Quartet Seminar. And each semester, they would assign a theme, so to speak. And that semester, they decided to assign all of the Bartok 6 string quartets. And my chamber group was assigned the 3rd string quartet. So funny enough, of course, with Bartok string quartets, you want to make sure that everything is as precise as possible. And of course, there's going to be mistakes. And one of those things is to make sure you know where you are. So during that time, I was also graduating and I needed to do a recital. And I was trying to figure out a program for my recital. So I asked my quartet, hey, do you guys want to do the Bartok for my recital? And everyone said, okay, sure. The scary moment was we did not manage to play through the entirety of the string quartet until my recital,
Oh,
which actually turned out well.
good. Who was your coach?
Oh,
Wasn't it the second violinist of the Cleveland Quartet?
no, we had the Cavani Quartet with us, and also Peter Saloff.
Well, Peter was in the Cleveland Quartet. He was
Yeah.
the second violinist, and he certainly played all the Bartok quartets.
Yeah.
Great coach.
Yes, he is. Mr. Saloff, he has such an exuberant energy to him, for sure. And I miss him. Yeah. Your third movement of the Meadowmounts, large skips and harmonics. One thing that I tell my students, if I show it to them as an example, I ask them, okay, so what do we do in order to make sure we achieve those large skips? And most of them know by now, but I tell them shifting exercises. Because if you do the shifting exercises, then it imprints in your muscles to turn it into muscle memory. And then your last movement, which is named perpetual motion, which is quite quick. And I had to write a lot of fingerings in order to make sure I knew where I was.
Well, I mean, as long as you have a purpose within your study of the piece, and make it fun to do instead of, oh my God, this is so hard. Well, everything. Listen, the Bach partitas are harder than anything else, that you can do because of many other problems, especially all the double stops and the many voices that are going. I mean, nobody, and you talked about Isai, that's another of those solo sonatas are just murder.
Yes.
But they're playable because Isai was a violinist and he could play them. And this is a big difference, when somebody says to you, why do you write such hard music? I don't write hard music because I want to make it hard. I write music that I want to hear,
Yes.
And if it's hard, well, okay. But is it worth doing? That is always my criteria. Is this worth doing? Instead of, well, it's maybe too hard. No, as long as it can be done. I have a story to tell about, not about a violinist, but about one of our great singers, Jan Gaetani. Jan Gaetani was one of our great mezzo-sopranos who made herself fame by doing George Crumb, not by doing Schubert first or Schumann or Brahms. She did those beautifully too, but she concentrated. I mean, she made George Crumb famous. And George wrote this piece for her, and it had a high C in it. And she said, George, I just don't have a high C. So he sat down with her, and they slowly worked up to the high C, and suddenly she had it.
Wow.
Because they worked on it together. And there's a similar story about Kolisch, the
Mm-hmm.
famous violinist, left-handed violinist,
Mm-hmm.
who worked with Bartok. The Kolisch Quartet was the ones that did the Bartok quartets the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And he sat down, Kolisch sat down with Bartok and said, you know, this is impossible. We can't. Bartok said, I'm not, he was a great pianist, I'm not a violinist, but I figured out that you can do that. And they could.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the composer that grows the technique, not the actual performer.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, it is true that Paganini certainly enlarged the technique, but he was also a composer and he wanted to hear what he heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing to see how composers push the boundaries of what is normal. Like, for example, Griset's Vortex Temporum, which I performed during VIVO season 3. I never thought to play my violin in such different ways. Like, there's one point in which he has both the violinist and the violist. We put our instrument on our lap sideways, and we actually draw our bow along the bridge. And Jack, who was also playing at the time, he was very impressed how steady I was able to keep my bow on the bridge.
Well, you know that there are black angels, you know, of Crumb.
Yes.
All kinds of you bow the other place. You know,
yes.
There you bow near the neck.
Yes.
And, now these things are okay. I, frankly, having been a violinist, I feel you can make the violin sound any way you want to without the extracurricular things. You know?
Yes. Yes.
Even though these pieces are difficult, they never ask you to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise on the violin.
Yes. Yes. But not something you would teach your students yet.
No, not yet, anyway.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the Black Angels, because we did it, I think it was last season, and we managed to, through the generosity of the Loft Violin Shop, we managed to utilize electronic instruments. So that was really fun to do.
I've never heard it on electronic instruments.
Yeah, because on George Crumb's music, it does say for electric instruments. So, yeah. So we thought we'd push the boundaries.
Because the Kronos played it on regular instruments.
Yes, they did do it on regular instruments. We decided to take it up a level, which was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, both George and I are in our 90s now, and still enjoying life, I'm happy to say.
That's good. That's really good.
It's interesting that George Crumb's son was a student of mine at Eastman.
Oh, really?
He was a cellist and a pianist, very good cellist, and he became a composer. He studied with me for 3 years. He's now professor of composition at the University of Oregon.
Oh.
Very good composer, by the way.
Very cool.
David Crumb.
David Crumb. Okay. I was kind of curious because it's not often that I talk to a great composer as yourself, but is there a different process or something that you kind of gear towards more in terms of writing compositions? And what I mean by that is solo, chamber music, or even orchestral compositions.
Well, when I start out a piece, I write it for somebody, you know, and I feel sort of the personality that I sense from them. With an orchestra, I always ask them to send me some recordings because I want to feel that my music can be part of their DNA. And I feel the same thing I've never, in the last, let's say 40 years, I've never written a piece that's not for somebody or some group or some large ensemble. And I always try to write for their personality, at least what I feel their personality is.
I see.
And in that way, I hope it will match what they want to do. And most of the time, I feel it's been successful. And I actually learned that from Hindemith, who said, always write for the very best. For instance, if you're writing a violin sonata in those days, write for Heifetz. No, don't write for Joe Schmo, write for Heifetz, and you know how Heifetz plays, and write as if he's playing your piece. And I've always remembered that.
Wow.
Because Hindemith, of course, wrote for himself. He played all those viola pieces. I mean, there are recordings of him playing some of the, even Schwandreher he recorded.
Wow. Well, that's absolutely incredible. And for me, it's always interesting to see a composer's process or how they try to translate. Sorry. Translate their ideas into the music. Like there was one composition that I was doing. I'm also part of the Columbus, Ohio Discovery Ensemble, which focuses primarily on new music. And I was working with this composer, and she was asking me if there's any way that I could create sort of a electricity effect on my violin. And I recalled doing another composition in which I had to put a bobby pin through my strings, which actually created that kind of electricity sound. So that's interesting.
Well, I tell you, I think electronic music is fine, but I also think that if you're writing for acoustic instruments, there is so much you can do with them without destroying or distracting from it.
Yes.
This might be a very good composer that wanted you to do that, but personally, I like the violin. I don't want to destroy the sound.
Yay! I like the violin too. That's why I play it. Well, for a final question, do you have any advice for any budding composers that are like going through this time right now, or?
Well, I think young composers today need to be very optimistic about their future, because if they are really good and trying to master the craft of composition, which I think is very important. I think every composer should really have a craft, a real craft that's based on the past, but looks forward to the future. And today we have opportunities like writing for you or writing for your group. And there's so many groups and so many willing performers today that want to play new music and actually do it beautifully, that they should be encouraged to write the very best music for any performer, any group that wants them to write for. In my time, when I was a young composer, we had to do everything ourselves. Very few people wanted to do our music. We never heard our orchestral pieces, while most young composers going to the major music schools or even lesser music schools hear their pieces played by the school orchestra. This is invaluable. And I think this is a great step ahead for composers of today. It's very great, I think, today to be a composer, a young composer. But of course, you have a lot of competition, and that's good too.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. And and as I said, it's a joy to learn your works. and I look forward to learning the duo that you just sent me.
Good. Good. I'm very happy, and thank you for having me.
Yes,
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
thank you.